She was 7 years old. It was the middle of a November night in rural Tennessee. The temperature outside had already dropped below freezing, and the woman who was supposed to be her mother, the woman who had stood in a church and made promises to her father, who had tucked her in and kissed her forehead and told her she was loved, that same woman had just opened the car door, told that little girl to walk toward the tree line, and driven away into the dark. No coat, no shoes, no food, no way home. Just a child, standing alone at the edge of a black forest, listening to the sound of tires disappearing down a gravel road, watching two red tail lights shrink until they were nothing. Just darkness, just cold, just silence. Her name was Grace, and the woman who left her there to die, the woman who drove home, made herself a cup of tea, and went to bed, her name was Linda. This is not a fairy tale. This is not a movie. This happened. And what Grace did next, alone in that forest at 7 years old, in temperatures that would challenge a grown man, what she did in those hours before anyone even knew she was missing, is something that a decorated search and rescue veteran described on the witness stand as the most extraordinary act of survival he had seen in 31 years of service. Stay with me, because by the time this story is over, you are going to understand that survival is not just about the body. It is about something that lives much deeper, something that no one, not even a stepmother with ice in her veins and greed in her heart, can take from a child who has decided she is not going to give up. Before we go into what happened that night, there are 3 things you need to understand. 3 questions that sit at the center of this story like a fire in the middle of a dark room. The first question is this: why would a woman who had chosen to marry a widower, who had chosen to step into the role of mother to his daughter, why would she drive a 7-year-old child 45 minutes out of town, into the woods, in the dead of winter, and leave her there? The answer, when it finally came out in that courtroom, changed everything. Because it turned out that what Linda did that night had nothing to do with rage. It had nothing to do with a moment of madness or a breakdown or a loss of control. It was calculated. It was cold. And it had been planned for a very long time. The second question is one that the rescue team asked each other in quiet voices when they finally found Grace. How does a 7-year-old girl, alone in freezing temperatures, with no survival training, no tools, and no adult guidance, manage to do what she did? How does she make it through not 1 night, but 2? And the third question, the one that this entire community, this entire county, talked about for years afterward, is what happened when Grace finally came face to face with Linda in that courtroom. What did a little girl say, from the witness stand, that made 12 jurors sit in complete silence, that made the court reporter stop typing, that made a judge close his eyes and press his fingers to the bridge of his nose? We are going to answer all 3 of those questions today. But first, we need to go back to the beginning. And before we do, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let's go back to where this story truly starts. The town of Clarkfield, Tennessee sits in a valley between 2 low mountain ridges, about 60 miles east of Nashville. It is the kind of town that looks like a postcard from a distance and feels like a memory up close. Small diners, church steeples, a main street with a hardware store and a pharmacy that has been owned by the same family since 1962. The kind of place where people still wave at strangers from their porches. The kind of place where a child can ride a bicycle to school and nobody worries. Where neighbors notice when your lights are on too late. Where everybody knows everybody's name and nobody locks their front door before 10 o'clock at night. It was in this town, in a yellow house with white shutters on Maple Creek Road, that Grace was born to Thomas and Carol Whitfield. Thomas worked for the county road department. He was a big, quiet man, the kind of man who fixed things without being asked, who showed up when people needed help moving furniture or repairing a fence, who had a reputation in Clarkfield for being the most dependable person you would ever meet. Carol was a schoolteacher. She taught 3rd grade at Clarkfield Elementary for 11 years. And by every account, she was exactly the kind of teacher that children remember for the rest of their lives. The kind who stays late, who notices when a child is struggling, who writes encouraging notes in the margins of papers instead of just marking answers wrong. People in Clarkfield who knew Carol Whitfield describe her the same way, over and over, using the same words: warm, devoted, full of life. Grace was their only child. She was born on a Wednesday morning in early April, and Thomas later told people that he had never in his life felt anything like the moment he held her for the first time. He said it felt like the whole world had rearranged itself to make room for something new. For the first 4 years of Grace's life, the Whitfield family was, by all appearances, exactly what they seemed to be: a happy, ordinary family in a small Tennessee town, living a quiet and good life. And then, in the spring of the year Grace turned 4, Carol Whitfield began to get headaches. At first they were dismissed as stress, end-of-school-year pressure, too many late nights grading papers. But the headaches became more frequent, and then more severe, and by the time Carol finally went to see Dr. Morrison at the Clarkfield Medical Center in July, what he found behind her left eye was something that neither she nor Thomas had any way to prepare for: a glioblastoma, one of the most aggressive forms of brain cancer known to medicine. She was 36 years old. The prognosis was devastating. Thomas quit talking about the future in terms of years. He began measuring time in months, and then in weeks, and he poured every ounce of himself into caring for Carol and being present for Grace, who was old enough to understand that something was very wrong with her mother, but not old enough to understand what dying meant. Carol Whitfield passed away on a Tuesday morning in February, 14 months after her diagnosis. Grace was 5 years old. She asked Thomas that afternoon if Mommy was coming back, and Thomas, a man who had not cried in front of anyone since he was a boy, sat down on the kitchen floor and held his daughter and wept. What followed was a period of grief that Thomas Whitfield has described as the hardest stretch of his life. He was a single father with a 5-year-old daughter, a demanding job, and a hole in his life where his wife used to be. He was not someone who asked for help easily. He was not someone who talked about his feelings or sought out company when he was hurting. He was the kind of man who showed up for others, but struggled to let others show up for him. And in that isolation, in that quiet grief, he was also profoundly lonely. His friends worried about him. His mother worried about him. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he worried about Grace, about what it meant for a little girl to grow up without a mother, about whether he was enough, about all the things that Carol would have known how to do that he was still learning. It was Thomas's co-worker, a man named Dale Hutchins, who first introduced him to Linda. It was at a company picnic in the summer, about 8 months after Carol's passing. Thomas almost didn't go. He almost stayed home, the way he had been staying home most weekends, grilling hamburgers in the backyard while Grace played on the swing set that Carol had helped him build the previous spring. But Dale had called him 3 times and told him that getting out of the house would do him good. And eventually Thomas had loaded Grace into the truck and driven to the park. Linda was Dale's cousin. She had recently moved to the Nashville area from Knoxville after what she described as a difficult divorce. She was attractive, well-dressed, and she had a way of making people feel that she was listening to them very carefully, a way of holding eye contact and tilting her head slightly and saying exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. Thomas talked to her for 2 hours at that picnic. He later said it was the first time since Carol's death that he had felt, even for a moment, like himself again. Linda, for her part, was warm and attentive toward Grace from the very beginning, offering to push her on the swings, bringing her a juice box from the cooler, crouching down to Grace's level, and speaking to her with a gentleness that Thomas noticed and that moved something in him that had been still for a long time. He did not know, standing in that park on that summer afternoon, watching this woman make his daughter laugh, that he was watching a performance. He did not know that the warmth was a costume. He did not know that behind the smile and the soft voice and the careful, patient attention, Linda had already begun to calculate. He did not know any of that yet. And that, in the end, is what made everything that followed so devastating. Thomas and Linda dated for almost a year before he proposed. Their relationship moved carefully, the way Thomas did everything, deliberately, without rushing, with a measured attention to Grace's comfort at every step. He asked Grace what she thought of Linda before he proposed. Grace was 6 by then, and her answer was the kind of thing that breaks your heart in retrospect. She said Linda was nice, and that she liked the way Linda did her hair sometimes, and that she made good pancakes. Thomas took that as a sign. Linda moved into the yellow house on Maple Creek Road in the spring, and they were married in a small ceremony at the Clarkfield Baptist Church in June. Grace was the flower girl. There are photographs from that wedding, photographs that Thomas has since said he cannot look at, in which Grace is smiling in a white dress with a ribbon in her hair, scattering rose petals down the aisle, and Linda is standing at the altar looking radiant and composed, looking, by every outward measure, like a woman beginning a beautiful new chapter of her life. The cracks, when they came, were so small at first that Thomas almost missed them entirely. Almost. It started with the small things. A tone of voice when Thomas was not in the room. A look that crossed Linda's face when Grace spilled something at dinner, or tracked mud through the hallway, or asked too many questions during a television program Linda was watching. These were not things that Thomas witnessed directly. They were things he sensed at the edges, a slight stiffness in the house when he came home from work, Grace being quieter than usual at the dinner table, the way she would glance at Linda before answering a question, as if she was calculating whether the answer was safe. Thomas told himself that blended families took time. He told himself that Grace was still grieving her mother and that adjustment was a process. He told himself that Linda was doing her best, that building a relationship with a child who was not your own was genuinely difficult, that the friction he was sensing was normal and temporary, and that it would ease with time. He wanted very much to believe these things. And so he did. But the teachers at Clarkfield Elementary were noticing something different. Grace's second-grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson, later described to investigators how Grace's behavior had shifted in the months after Thomas and Linda's marriage. Where Grace had previously been a bright, talkative child who raised her hand often and played easily with other children during recess, she had become withdrawn and watchful. She stopped volunteering answers in class. She started staying close to Mrs. Patterson during recess instead of playing with her classmates. She stopped talking about her home life altogether. Mrs. Patterson called the Whitfield house once in October to discuss what she was observing. Linda answered the phone. She was, by Mrs. Patterson's account, gracious and concerned and entirely convincing. She explained that Grace was still processing the loss of her mother, that they were all working through it as a family, that she would be sure to schedule some time with a counselor for Grace if things did not improve. Mrs. Patterson thanked her and hung up and made a note in her file. That note would later become a piece of evidence in a criminal trial. What was happening inside that yellow house on Maple Creek Road, behind the white shutters and the tidy flower beds and the perfectly ordinary exterior, was something that would only come to be fully understood after Grace was found in those woods. It came out in pieces, the way these things always do, in court documents, in investigator interviews, in the quiet and devastating testimony of a child who had spent months afraid to say the things she knew. Linda had not been violent with Grace in ways that left marks easy to explain away. She had been methodical. She had been patient. She had used the tools available to her: isolation, criticism, the withdrawal of warmth, the deliberate erosion of a child's sense of safety and worth, in ways that are harder to see and harder to prove, but no less destructive. Grace was not allowed to call her grandmother, Carol's mother, without Linda present in the room. Visits to Carol's parents were gradually, quietly phased out. Thomas, who worked long hours and who trusted his wife and who did not understand what he was not seeing, did not notice the isolation happening. He did not notice that Grace had stopped mentioning her grandmother. He did not notice that the drawings Grace used to make, bright, cheerful pictures of houses and flowers and butterflies that she used to bring home from school and stick to the refrigerator door, had stopped appearing. He did not notice, until it was far too late, that his daughter had gone somewhere inside herself and pulled the door shut behind her. But there was one person who was paying attention. A woman named Ruth Calloway, who lived 3 houses down from the Whitfields on Maple Creek Road, had been friends with Carol Whitfield for 12 years. Ruth had watched Grace grow up from a newborn. She had held Grace in the hospital the day she was born. She had been at Carol's bedside in those final weeks, and she had wept at Carol's funeral, and she had brought casseroles to Thomas in the months that followed, and she had kept a quiet, steady eye on Grace ever since, the way that women in small towns sometimes do when they have lost a friend and are watching over what that friend left behind. Ruth Calloway began noticing the changes in Grace in the fall of that year. She noticed that Grace no longer waved from the yard when Ruth walked past. She noticed that Grace no longer came over to sit on Ruth's porch and eat cookies the way she had done every Saturday morning since she was old enough to walk across the yard by herself. She noticed that when she did see Grace outside, the child looked thin and tired, and she held herself differently, with a kind of careful stillness, like an animal that has learned to make itself small. Ruth went to Thomas once. She sat at his kitchen table and told him, as kindly as she knew how, that she was worried about Grace. Thomas listened. He thanked her. He said that the adjustment had been hard, but that they were working through it. And then, because Thomas Whitfield was a man who believed in his wife and in his family, and in the idea that things would get better if he gave them time, he walked Ruth to the door and told her not to worry. Ruth drove home and sat in her living room and turned on the television and could not stop thinking about Grace's face, and the way it no longer looked like the face of a child who felt safe. She did not go back to Thomas. That is something she has said, since, that she will carry with her for the rest of her life. What Ruth did not know, what no one outside the walls of that yellow house fully knew, was that Linda's treatment of Grace had been growing steadily worse over the months since the wedding. And what Thomas did not know, what he had absolutely no knowledge of, what he would not learn until a detective laid a document on a table in front of him and watched his face go white, was why. Because Linda had not simply decided, one day, that she did not want Grace around. She had a reason. A very specific, very calculated, very cold-blooded reason. And that reason had been sitting in a file at the office of an attorney in Nashville since the day Carol Whitfield died, waiting, the way a trap waits, for the right moment to spring. Carol Whitfield, before she passed, had worked with an estate attorney to establish a small trust for Grace. It was not a fortune. It was the kind of modest inheritance that a careful schoolteacher on a public school salary builds over a lifetime, savings, a small life insurance policy, and most significantly, a 10-acre piece of land on the eastern side of Clarkfield that had been in Carol's family for 3 generations. Her grandmother had planted apple trees on that land. Her mother had kept a garden there every summer. Carol had played there as a child and had always intended to build a house on it someday. The land was, in terms of raw market value, not a dramatic sum. But in Carol's family, it was everything. It was memory and continuity and the sense that something of her would remain in the world after she was gone, waiting for Grace. The terms of the trust were straightforward. The land and the assets would be held in trust until Grace turned 18. If Grace did not survive to adulthood, the assets would pass to her legal guardian. Linda had found the trust documents in the filing cabinet in Thomas's home office 3 months after moving in. Thomas had not hidden them. Why would he? He had not imagined that his wife would stand in his office one afternoon, reading through the terms of his dead wife's estate, and make a decision that only a certain kind of person is capable of making. But that is what happened. And from that moment on, everything Linda did, every smile, every reassurance, every concerned phone call to a teacher, every performance of love and care, was a calculation. Thomas Whitfield was not her husband. He was a variable in an equation. And Grace was the obstacle standing between Linda and everything she wanted. It was the 14th of November. Thomas had left 2 days earlier for a work trip to Memphis, a road crew assessment that the county required him to attend. He had kissed Grace goodbye on a Wednesday morning, told her to be good, told Linda he would call that evening, and driven away. Grace watched the truck disappear around the corner of Maple Creek Road from the living room window. She stood there for a long moment after he was gone, and then she turned around and looked at Linda, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, holding a coffee mug, watching her. Grace said nothing. Linda said nothing. And then Linda smiled, a slow, private kind of smile, and said, "It's just us girls now." Grace went to her room. She sat on her bed. She picked up the stuffed rabbit that had been her mother's, the one Carol had kept on her bedside table and that Thomas had given to Grace after the funeral, and she held it against her chest. She did not know, sitting there in her room with her rabbit, that the woman in the kitchen had already decided that she would not still be in this house when Thomas came home from Memphis. The first day passed quietly. Linda made dinner, watched television, went to bed. The second day, Thursday, Grace went to school as normal. She sat in Mrs. Patterson's class and did her work and ate her lunch alone and came home on the school bus and walked up the driveway and let herself in through the back door with the key Thomas had given her. Linda was in the living room. She told Grace to do her homework and go to bed early, that she wasn't feeling well. Grace did as she was told. She always did as she was told, because the alternative, the cold silence, the sharp edges of Linda's voice when she was displeased, was worse. She ate the peanut butter sandwich Linda left on the kitchen counter, did her spelling homework at the kitchen table, and went to bed. She kept the rabbit on the pillow next to her. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the house. She fell asleep, and in the early hours of Friday morning, sometime between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning, Grace woke to Linda standing in her bedroom doorway, the hall light behind her, telling her to get up and get dressed. Linda's voice was calm. It was the careful, practiced calm that Grace had learned to be most afraid of, the voice Linda used when she had already made a decision and was not going to explain it. Grace asked where they were going. Linda said they were going for a drive. She said there was someone Grace needed to see. Grace asked who. Linda said it was a surprise. Grace put on the clothes she had worn the day before because they were folded on the chair beside her bed. She put on her sneakers. She did not take her rabbit. She has said, since, that she thinks about that sometimes, about the fact that she left her rabbit on the pillow, and she is glad she did not take it because she would not have wanted it to be in those woods. Linda drove in silence. She took Route 7 east out of Clarkfield, and then turned south on a county road that Grace had never been on, a narrow two-lane road that wound through farmland and then into the foothills, where the trees closed in on both sides and the road surface turned from asphalt to gravel. Grace watched the world outside the car window. The headlights lit a narrow tunnel of gravel and tree trunks and white road markers. There were no other cars. There were no lights from houses. There was nothing. Just the road and the trees and the cold dark outside and Linda's hands on the steering wheel, still and steady. Grace asked again where they were going. Linda said they were almost there. Grace looked at the clock on the dashboard. It was 1:47 in the morning. She did not understand why they were almost anywhere at 1:47 in the morning, but she knew, in the way that children know things they cannot put into words, that something was very wrong. She had known it since she woke up. She had known it, in some version of the feeling, for months. But she had never been as afraid as she was in that car, on that road, in the dark, with Linda's face unreadable and the trees crowding in from both sides and the gravel road narrowing until it was barely wide enough for a car. Linda pulled over. She turned off the headlights. In the sudden dark, Grace could see nothing, not the road, not the trees, not her own hands in her lap. She heard the engine tick as it cooled. She heard Linda's door open. She heard Linda's footsteps on the gravel, coming around the car. Her door opened. Linda told her to get out. Grace asked why. Linda said she needed to look at something in the trees, and she needed Grace to come with her. Grace got out of the car. The cold hit her immediately, a sharp, hard cold that she had not been prepared for. That caught her in the chest and took her breath. She was wearing a long-sleeved shirt and jeans. No coat. The gravel was hard and cold under the thin rubber soles of her sneakers. Linda took her hand and walked her to the edge of the road and pointed into the dark between the trees. She said to walk toward the big tree, the one straight ahead. Grace peered into the dark. She could not see a tree. She could not see anything. She said she could not see it. Linda said to keep walking. It was just ahead. She would catch up with her in a moment. Grace took 2 steps forward into the tree line. The ground changed under her feet, softer, uneven, covered in leaves and roots and pine needles. She turned around. She could see the pale shape of the road, the dark bulk of the car. She could see Linda's silhouette. She said, "Aren't you coming?" Linda did not answer. Grace heard a car door close. She heard an engine start. She saw the headlights come on, twin beams that did not point in her direction, that swept away from her as the car turned, as the gravel crunched, as the red tail lights appeared and grew small and disappeared around a curve. And then there was nothing. No engine sound. No lights. No road. Just the dark and the cold and the silence of a Tennessee forest at 2 in the morning, and a 7-year-old girl standing at the edge of it in a long-sleeved shirt, alone. Grace stood there for a long time. She did not move. She has said, talking about it later, that she waited because she thought Linda was coming back. She thought it was a mistake. She thought maybe Linda had driven a little way down the road and turned around and would come back any second. She stood at the edge of the trees and watched the road and waited. A minute passed, then 5, then more. The cold worked its way through her shirt. She began to shiver. And somewhere in those minutes, as the cold got heavier and the road stayed empty and the silence stayed total, Grace understood, with a clarity that no 7-year-old should ever have to reach, that Linda was not coming back, that this was not a mistake, that she had been left here on purpose. She told herself not to cry. She told herself that crying would not help. She told herself to think. Those 3 things, the deliberate, quiet decision to stop waiting, to stop hoping Linda would return, and to start thinking, are what kept her alive. A 7-year-old girl, alone in a freezing forest at 2 in the morning, made the decision not to collapse and not to panic, but to think, to use what she knew, to survive. Grace knew 2 things from school. She knew that if you were lost in the woods, you should find water and stay near it, because rescuers looked along water sources. She had learned this from a safety lesson in 1st grade that she had apparently retained with perfect clarity. And she knew that you should not wander too far from where you started, because the wider you ranged, the harder you were to find. She walked carefully back to the edge of the road, looked both ways, and registered what she could. She memorized the shape of the tree line. She noted the direction the car had gone. And then she turned and walked back into the forest, slowly and carefully, with her arms out to feel what was in front of her, because the dark beneath those trees was absolute. She found a creek. It took her perhaps 20 minutes of slow, careful walking to find it, navigating by the sound of it, a low, quiet sound she almost missed, the murmur of water over stones somewhere to her left. She followed the sound until the ground went soft and slightly downhill, and then there it was, a narrow creek, maybe 6 feet across, running clear and cold between 2 low banks. She crouched and put her hand in it. The water was ice cold. She drank from it anyway, using both hands cupped together, because she did not know when she would drink again. Then she looked at the trees along the bank and began to assess. She found a large fallen oak tree near the bank, a tree that had come down at an angle against another tree, so that its trunk formed a low roof of sorts. She gathered leaves. She gathered pine needles. She worked in the dark, by feel, moving as fast as she could while her hands shook and her teeth chattered. She packed leaves and pine needles into the space under the fallen trunk. She crawled inside. She pulled more leaves over herself, over her legs and her arms and her torso, and she curled into the smallest shape she could make, and she held herself still, and she breathed, and she did not cry, and she waited for morning. Thomas Whitfield called home from Memphis on Thursday evening. Linda answered and told him that Grace was already in bed, that they'd had a nice day, that everything was fine. He accepted this without question. He was tired from a long day of meetings. He said good night and told her he would call the next evening. On Friday morning, he got up early and went to his first session of the day. He did not call home because it was early and he did not want to wake anyone. He went through the morning thinking about nothing except road surface assessments and drainage specifications. He had no idea. How could he? The call that came in that afternoon, not to his phone, but to the county road department's main line, because his cell was in a dead zone, was from Mrs. Patterson at Clarkfield Elementary. Grace had not come to school. There had been no call to report an absence. The school had tried the house twice and received no answer. They were following protocol. Was everything all right? The department secretary took the message and eventually reached Thomas on a borrowed phone. He called home immediately. Linda answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm. She told him that Grace was with a friend from school, a girl named Madison whose mother had offered to have her for the weekend since Thomas was away. She said she had meant to call the school and leave a message, but it had slipped her mind. Thomas asked for the number of Madison's mother. Linda said she didn't have it in front of her, that she would find it and send it to him. He waited. The number never came. He called back. No answer. He called Dale Hutchins, who called his cousin on Linda's old cell number, which had been disconnected. And in the space of a single hour, on a Friday afternoon in Memphis, Thomas Whitfield felt the floor of his world give way beneath him. He was in his truck and driving home before the sun went down. He was calling 911 from the road. He was doing 90 miles an hour on a state highway, holding his phone against his ear, listening to a dispatcher ask him to describe his daughter, and the words coming out of his mouth, 7 years old, brown hair, last seen Thursday night, never showed up at school. Those words felt like something happening to someone else, in a dream, in a story that could not possibly be real. When Thomas pulled into the driveway on Maple Creek Road at 8:30 that Friday night, Linda was there. She was standing on the porch with a glass of water in her hand, and when Thomas got out of the truck, she came down the steps and put her arms around him, and she cried. She cried convincingly, and she held on, and she said she was so scared, and she said she didn't know where Grace could have gone, and she said she had been calling around all day and nobody had seen her. The Clarkfield County Sheriff's Department had 2 deputies at the house within 20 minutes. Linda sat at the kitchen table and answered their questions in a steady, clear voice. She said she had last seen Grace Thursday evening, that Grace had been in her room. She said she had checked on her before bed and the child was sleeping. She said that on Friday morning Grace was simply gone. She said she had assumed, at first, that Grace had gone to a neighbor's house the way she sometimes did. Specifically, she named Ruth Calloway, 3 doors down. She said she had not immediately panicked because Grace had done this before. The deputies wrote everything down. One of them looked at Linda's hands while she talked, a habit, a way of reading people, and noted later that her hands were completely still. She did not wring them. She did not fidget. She held her water glass with a steady grip and looked the deputies directly in the eye and told them her story without a single hesitation. He wrote in his notes, calm, cooperative, no obvious signs of deception. He was wrong, but he did not know it yet, because Linda had been preparing this performance for months. The search began that night. Volunteers from 3 counties showed up by 10 o'clock. The Clarkfield Volunteer Fire Department brought lights and generators. Ruth Calloway was at the Whitfield house within minutes of hearing the news. She had seen the sheriff's cars from her window and walked down the road in her bathrobe to find out what was happening. When she was told Grace was missing, she sat down on the porch steps and put her face in her hands. She stayed there all night, making coffee, answering questions, doing whatever was asked of her. She also, in those first hours, told the deputies something that they noted but did not immediately act on. That she had always had a feeling about Linda, that something had never seemed right, that Grace had changed after Linda moved in. The deputy who took her statement thanked her and told her they would keep everything in mind. The search fanned out through the neighborhood first, then expanded to the surrounding roads and fields. Dogs were brought in. A helicopter made 2 passes over the eastern ridge. No sign of Grace. The night passed. Saturday morning came cold and gray, and the search continued, and Thomas stood at the end of his driveway watching the volunteers go in and out and felt a kind of helplessness so complete that it had no bottom. The detective who would ultimately break the case was a woman named Sergeant Karen Booker, assigned to the Clarkfield County Sheriff's Criminal Investigations Unit. Karen Booker had been doing this job for 22 years. She had seen grief before, real grief and performed grief, and she understood the difference the way a musician understands the difference between a note played truly and a note played for effect. She sat down with Linda on Saturday morning, not at the house, but at the sheriff's office in what she called a more comfortable setting. Linda agreed to come in without hesitation. She sat across the table from Karen Booker and answered every question with the same calm, open, cooperative manner she had shown the deputies the night before. She told the same story. Grace had been in her room Thursday night. Friday morning she was gone. She had assumed Ruth Calloway. She was terrified. She could not imagine what could have happened. Karen Booker listened. She nodded. She thanked Linda for her time. And when Linda left the room, she turned to her junior colleague, Detective Ray Simmons, and said, "She's lying." She said it the way someone says something they are completely certain of. Not a suspicion, a fact. And then she set about proving it. The first crack in Linda's story appeared on Saturday afternoon. A man named Earl Grover, who owned a logging operation east of town, and who had been out late Thursday night checking an equipment situation on one of his access roads, came forward to say that he had seen a car pulled off on the county road near the Forest Service boundary, sometime around 2 in the morning. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. People sometimes parked out there. But when he saw the news and heard that a child was missing, he went to the sheriff's office. He described the car. He described the color, the make, the general shape of it. It matched the car Linda drove. Karen Booker drove out to the location Earl Grover described. She stood on the gravel road in the cold and looked at the tree line and felt something happen in her chest. A cold certainty, the kind that only comes when the pieces of something terrible begin to fit together. She called for the search teams to redirect. She called for the dogs to be brought to this location. She got back in her cruiser and called the sheriff and told him they needed to bring Linda back in for additional questioning. That same afternoon, Linda was brought back to the sheriff's office. This time, Karen Booker did not nod and thank her. This time, Karen Booker placed Earl Grover's description of the car on the table between them and asked Linda to explain how her car had come to be parked on a logging access road 45 minutes from their house at 2 o'clock on Friday morning. The same morning, she claimed Grace had simply vanished from her bedroom. Linda's composure, for the first time, flickered. It was brief. It was small. But Karen Booker saw it, and she did not look away. Linda said she must have the car confused with another. She said she hadn't left the house that night. She said Earl Grover was mistaken. Karen Booker said that was fine, and that they would want to look at Linda's phone records to confirm her movements, and that she was sure that would clear everything up. The silence that followed that sentence lasted 4 full seconds. Karen Booker counted them. The dogs found Grace on Saturday evening. It was just before 6 o'clock, the light already going gray, the temperature dropping again toward freezing, when the lead search and rescue dog, a bloodhound named Cooper who had been in service for 7 years, picked up a scent line from the place on the road where Karen Booker had stood and pulled his handler into the tree line at a run. The handler, a veteran rescue worker named Marcus Webb, moved through the forest in the growing dark, following Cooper, calling Grace's name. The creek was about a quarter mile in. The fallen oak was another 100 yards along the bank. And there, in the shelter Grace had made from leaves and pine needles and the angle of a fallen tree, curled as small as she could make herself, her lips pale and her fingers white, but her eyes. When Marcus Webb pushed back the layer of leaves and said her name, her eyes were open. She looked up at him. She did not cry. She said, in a voice that was steady and clear, "I knew somebody would come. I wrote help with the rocks." Marcus Webb looked to his left and saw the stones she had arranged in a clearing, the letters HLP, laid out in careful straight lines with river stones she had carried from the creek bed, positioned in an open patch of ground visible from the slope above. He has said, since, in every account he has given of that moment, that in 31 years of search and rescue, he has never seen anything like it. He sat down on the forest floor next to a 7-year-old girl who had survived 39 hours alone in a November forest in Tennessee, and he put his arms around her and held her, and he cried. Grace patted his back. She said, "It's okay. I'm okay." She had been saying this to herself for 39 hours. She meant it. Grace was airlifted to Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville. She was treated for mild hypothermia, dehydration, and lacerations on her feet from walking on roots and frozen ground. The attending physician later told investigators that given the temperature that night and the duration of exposure, Grace's survival was medically speaking, extraordinary. He said that the way she had insulated herself with the leaf pile had been the critical factor. He said an adult without survival training might not have thought to do it. He said he had been practicing pediatric emergency medicine for 16 years, and he had never had a patient quite like Grace Whitfield. Thomas was at her bedside when she woke the morning after her rescue. He was holding her hand when she opened her eyes. He later said that when she looked at him, his first thought was that she looked older, that something in her face had changed, that she had gone somewhere in those 39 hours that had rearranged her from the inside. He asked her if she was okay, and she said yes. He asked her what happened, and she took a slow breath and, in a clear and deliberate voice, told him exactly what Linda had done. Thomas Whitfield has said, in the aftermath of everything, that there are moments in a person's life that alter everything that comes after them, that divide a life into a before and an after, the way a bone fractures cleanly and leaves a line that never fully disappears. He has said that sitting at that hospital bedside, listening to his 7-year-old daughter describe being walked to the edge of a forest in the middle of the night and left there, was one of those moments. He has said that he felt, while she talked, as though the person he had been, the man who had trusted Linda, the man who had stood at an altar and made vows, the man who had told Ruth Calloway not to worry, was dissolving quietly while his daughter spoke, and that the person who replaced him was someone simpler and colder and entirely focused on one thing. He left the hospital room and called Karen Booker. Karen Booker already had Linda in an interview room. Linda was, at that moment, still maintaining her story. She was still steady. She was still cooperative. She was still the performance. Then Karen Booker walked into the interview room and put a single sentence on the table. Grace told us everything. Linda looked at the detective across the table. The performance held for another 3 seconds. And then it cracked. Not dramatically, not with tears or shouting or collapse. It cracked quietly, the way a mask cracks when the person behind it finally stops holding it in place. The hands on the table, which had been so still, moved. A small, involuntary movement, a slight tightening of the fingers. Linda said nothing for a very long time. And then she said, "She's confused." She was half asleep. Karen Booker placed Earl Grover's statement on the table. She placed the cell phone tower data, obtained from Linda's carrier that afternoon, which showed Linda's phone pinging a tower adjacent to the Forest Service Road at 2:17 in the morning on Friday. She placed a fuel purchase record, Linda's debit card, used at a gas station on Route 7 East at 12:59 a.m., in the direction of the county road, in the direction of the forest. She placed these things on the table one at a time, the way a person lays down cards when they already know they have won. Linda looked at each piece of paper. The hands went still again, and then she asked for a lawyer. The arrest of Linda Whitfield, née Linda Carver, happened on a Sunday evening, 48 hours after Grace had been found. Thomas was at the hospital with Grace. Ruth Calloway was there too, sitting in the waiting room with a thermos of coffee, reading to Grace from a picture book when Thomas needed to step outside. The news spread through Clarkfield the way news spreads through small towns, fast, and with a quality of shock that makes people stop what they are doing and sit down. The diner on Main Street fell quiet when the word came in. The pharmacist, old Mr. Holt, who had known Carol Whitfield since she was a girl and who had attended her funeral and who had given Thomas a bottle of Carol's favorite cologne as a wedding gift when he remarried, had to close up early because he could not stop his hands from shaking. And in the yellow house on Maple Creek Road, Linda Carver was handcuffed and walked to a sheriff's department vehicle while 3 neighbors watched from their driveways, and the house with the white shutters and the tidy flower bed sat empty and quiet in the November dark. The investigation that followed uncovered the full picture of what Linda had planned. Detectives found, in a locked box in the closet of the room Linda used as a home office, a copy of the trust documents she had removed from Thomas's filing cabinet. She had annotated them. There were pencil marks next to specific clauses. The clause about the property passing to Grace's legal guardian if Grace did not survive to adulthood. There were dates written in the margins. There was a note, in Linda's handwriting, that simply read, "After Memphis." The prosecution would later argue in court that Linda had been waiting for a specific opportunity, a time when Thomas would be far enough away, for long enough, that she could act and establish a plausible window of confusion around Grace's disappearance. The Memphis work trip, announced 3 weeks in advance, had given her that window. She had chosen the location in the forest, the logging access road near the Forest Service boundary, deliberately. It was far enough from town that an abandoned child was unlikely to be found quickly. It was in a section of forest with no cell coverage and no through traffic. It had been, in its way, meticulously chosen. The forest had just not cooperated. The forest had given Grace a creek and a fallen oak tree and the knowledge, stored in a 7-year-old's memory from a first-grade safety lesson, that rescuers look along water. The district attorney's office filed charges that included attempted first-degree murder, criminal abandonment of a child, child endangerment, and fraud connected to the trust fund scheme. Linda's attorney entered a not guilty plea on every count, and the case was set for trial. The trial of Linda Carver began on a Monday morning in March, in the 19th Circuit Court of Clarkfield County, before the Honorable Judge Arthur Klein. It lasted 13 days. The courtroom was full every single day. People drove in from neighboring counties. The media, local at first, and then state, and then national, as the story spread, set up outside the courthouse and broadcast the arrivals and departures of the key figures with a quiet, steady attention that made the whole town feel, for those 2 weeks, as though it was living at the center of something enormous. Thomas Whitfield sat at the front of the gallery every day. He sat with his hands folded and his jaw set, and he watched, and he listened, and the people sitting near him later said that he never once looked away from the witness stand, no matter what was being said. Ruth Calloway sat beside him on most days. She brought him coffee in a thermos. She did not talk much. She was just there. The prosecution's case was built on 4 pillars: Earl Grover's eyewitness account of the car, the phone and payment records placing Linda at the scene, the annotated trust documents found in the locked box, and Grace. Grace Whitfield, now 8 years old, testified on the 9th day of the trial. The courtroom, which had buzzed and murmured through 12 days of procedural testimony, forensic evidence, and expert witnesses, went absolutely still when she walked in. She was small for her age. She was wearing a blue dress that Thomas had bought for the occasion, and she carried no stuffed animal and held no one's hand. She walked to the witness stand and was sworn in and sat down and looked at the prosecutor, a woman named Assistant District Attorney Sandra Hughes, and said she was ready. She answered every question in a clear, steady voice. She described the drive. She described the gravel road and the darkness and Linda telling her to walk toward the trees. She described turning around and watching the car leave. She described the cold and the forest and the creek and the fallen oak and the leaves. She described spelling out help with the river stones in the gray light of Saturday morning. She described deciding not to cry because crying would not help. She described knowing that someone would come because she had made herself findable. She described waiting. The courtroom was so quiet during her testimony that a woman in the 3rd row later said she could hear the clock on the wall. Every 12 minutes, it clicked forward 1 minute. She counted them. Grace testified for 2 hours and 11 minutes. She was not flustered by the defense attorney's cross-examination. She answered his questions the way she had answered the prosecution's, directly, clearly, without drama or embellishment. When he suggested that she might have been confused, that she had been half asleep and may have misremembered, she looked at him and said, in a voice that did not waver, "I was not asleep. I remember everything." The defense attorney sat down. But it was the moment near the end of Grace's testimony, a moment that ADA Sandra Hughes had not planned, that emerged from the narrative of the story itself, that the courtroom would talk about for years afterward. Sandra Hughes had asked Grace one final question. Was there anything else she wanted the jury to understand about what had happened? Grace was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands in her lap. And then she looked up, and she looked not at the jury, not at the prosecutor, but across the courtroom at Linda Carver, sitting at the defense table, and she said, "I want her to know that I didn't die. And I'm not going to." The clock on the wall clicked forward. Nobody moved. Judge Klein pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose and closed his eyes for a moment. The court reporter's hands were still on her keys. Thomas Whitfield, in the front row of the gallery, closed his eyes and breathed. And Linda Carver, for the first time in 13 days of trial, looked down at the defense table and did not look back up for a very long time. The jury deliberated for 5 hours and 40 minutes. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted, not in the dramatic fashion of movies, but in a sudden release of held breath, a collective exhalation, the sound of something long and painful coming to its end. Thomas Whitfield put his face in his hands. Ruth Calloway put her arm around him. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say. At sentencing, 3 weeks later, Judge Klein addressed Linda Carver directly before delivering the sentence. He said that in 27 years on the bench, he had encountered many defendants who had committed acts of violence, and that the worst of them, in his experience, were not the ones who had lost control, but the ones who had never lost it. The ones who had planned, who had calculated, who had performed love and care while concealing something entirely different. He said that Linda Carver belonged in that category. He sentenced her to 25 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 18 years. The sentence carried within it a particular weight that did not escape anyone in that courtroom. Grace Whitfield would be 26 years old before Linda Carver was eligible to ask for freedom. She would be, by that time, years past the birthday that Linda had tried to ensure she never reached. Thomas sold the yellow house on Maple Creek Road in the spring. He and Grace moved to a smaller town 40 miles east, closer to the Smoky Mountains, closer, though Thomas did not say this, to the kind of quiet that he needed. They took their time. They did not rush. Thomas got a job with a new county road department, and Grace enrolled in a new school, and they settled into a life that was smaller and simpler than the one they had left, and they took care of each other. Ruth Calloway visited them every few months, driving out on Sundays with a casserole or a pie, sitting at the kitchen table and talking about Carol and about ordinary things and about Grace's school and Thomas's work. Grace began drawing again. The drawings came back slowly, the way spring comes back after a hard winter, tentatively at first, a few colors, a few shapes, and then with more confidence, more color, more life. Thomas kept every one of them. He has a folder of them, thick as a phone book, in the filing cabinet in his home office. Next to the folder is a framed copy of Carol's photograph from their wedding day. It has been there since they moved in. It has not moved. Grace Whitfield is not a child anymore. The little girl who survived 39 hours in a November forest and walked into a courtroom and looked her stepmother in the eye and said, "I didn't die, and I'm not going to," has grown into a woman who carries that night with her the way some people carry a scar, not as a wound that is still open, but as a mark that tells the story of something you endured and came out the other side of. She studied child psychology at the University of Tennessee. She wrote her senior thesis on the psychological impact of caregiver betrayal on children in the formative years and was asked, after graduation, to present it at a conference on child welfare policy in Nashville. She stood at the podium in a conference room full of social workers and caseworkers and attorneys and legislators, and she spoke for 45 minutes without notes. And when she finished, the room gave her a standing ovation that lasted, by one account, nearly 3 minutes. She has worked since as an advocate for children in the foster care and child protective services system in Tennessee. The children who, like her, find themselves at the mercy of systems and people that are supposed to protect them. She has testified before the state legislature twice, pushing for changes in the cross-reporting requirements between schools, medical providers, and law enforcement. She has sat across from children in crisis and looked them in the eye with the particular authority of someone who has been where they are and knows that it does not have to be the last place they ever are. She went back to the forest once. It was a Saturday in late June, 6 years after the trial, and she drove out alone on Route 7 East and turned south on the county road and parked where the gravel begins and sat in her car for a long time before getting out. She walked into the trees. She found the creek. She found the fallen oak, still there, still leaning against the other tree, still sheltering the same small hollow beneath it. She stood next to it and put her hand on the bark. The forest in June is a different thing than the forest in November. It is green and warm and loud with birds and the smell of pine resin and the sound of the creek, which runs faster in summer. It is not dark. It is not cold. It does not feel like the same place, and it does, at the same time, feel exactly like the same place. She stood there for a while. She has said she is not sure how long. She did not cry. She has said that she went there not to grieve and not to perform any particular ceremony of forgiveness or resolution, but simply to see it in the light, to see the place as it actually was, stripped of the darkness and the cold and the terror of that night, to see it as just a forest, just trees and a creek and a fallen log, and to understand that what happened there was not the end of her story, that it was the place where her story really began. She drove home afterward and called Thomas and told him she had gone back, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What was it like?" And she said, "It was just woods, Dad. It was just woods." He said, "Yeah." They were both quiet on the phone for a moment, the way people are quiet when words are not the right tool for what they are feeling. And then Thomas said, "She'd be proud of you." And Grace knew he was not talking about Linda. The 10 acres of land that Carol Whitfield set aside in trust are still there, on the eastern side of Clarkfield. The apple trees Carol's grandmother planted are still bearing fruit, though they are old now and need careful tending. Grace holds the deed. She visits in the fall, when the apples are ready. She has plans for the land, not to sell it, not to develop it, but to build something quiet there someday, something that feels like the place her mother intended it to be. She has not built it yet. She is not in a hurry. She is 23 years old and she has, in her own words, a great deal of time. Linda Carver remains in the Riverbend Correctional Facility in Nashville. She has applied for early release consideration twice and been denied twice. She will be eligible for parole review in 11 years. Grace has been notified of both applications. She has responded each time with a written statement to the parole board. She has said, in those statements, that she does not wish Linda harm. She has said that she does not spend her days in anger. She has also said, clearly and without ambiguity, that she does not believe Linda Carver poses anything less than a continuing risk to vulnerable people, and that the decision of the jury and the sentence of the court should stand. The parole board has agreed, both times. Grace's statements are, by all accounts, among the most precisely reasoned and quietly devastating documents in the parole board's files. Thomas Whitfield retired from the county road department 2 years ago. He lives in the smaller town east of Clarkfield with a dog named Earl, named, with a kind of quiet humor, after the man whose late-night equipment check helped save his daughter's life. He and Grace have dinner together every Sunday. He still has the folder of drawings, thick as a phone book, in his home office. This story is about a lot of things. It is about greed and what it does to people who let it run without limit. It is about the gap between what a person shows the world and what they are doing in the dark. It is about the way systems fail, the teacher who noticed and the report that went nowhere, the neighbor who worried and the door that closed politely in her face, the protections that existed on paper and the child who fell through the spaces between them anyway. It is about all of those things and the importance of paying attention to the small signs, the quiet changes, the child who has gone somewhere inside herself, and the door that has closed. But more than any of those things, this story is about what a 7-year-old girl did when she was left alone in the dark with nothing. She did not wait to be saved. She found the creek. She built the shelter. She spelled help in river stones in a clearing where someone might see it from above, because she understood, at 7 years old, in a freezing Tennessee forest at 2 in the morning, that being found required making yourself findable. She did not give up. She did not collapse. She decided, with whatever clarity and whatever stubbornness and whatever deep instinctive will to live runs in the blood of some people and will simply not be extinguished, that she was going to be here when the sun came up. And she was. There is something in Grace Whitfield's story that speaks to something older than any legal proceeding or policy reform or courtroom verdict. It speaks to something that has no name, but that most of us, somewhere in ourselves, recognize. The thing that holds on when every reason to let go has been taken away. The thing that says, not yet. The thing that spells help in river stones because it refuses to be silent. Whatever you want to call that thing, courage, instinct, will, the stubborn refusal of a child to accept that this is how the story ends, Grace had it. And because she had it, she is here. And because she is here, other children in Tennessee have better protections than they did before. And because she is here, this story exists. And stories like this one, told and retold, are part of how the world, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely, learns to do better. We owe it to Grace Whitfield to keep telling it. And we owe it to every child who has ever stood at the edge of the dark and made the decision to survive, to make sure that the world they survive into is one that is paying closer attention than it was before. That is the only ending to a story like this one that is truly worthy of the person at the center of it. And before you go, we want to ask you something. At what point in Grace's story did you know that something was deeply wrong with Linda? Was it the wedding? The way Grace changed at school? The locked box? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about the children in your life, the signs that are easy to miss, the conversations worth having, share it with someone. Not for the numbers. Because Grace's story deserves to be heard by as many people as possible. And if you want to be here when we tell the next one, subscribe. We have a story coming that begins with two brothers, one identity, and a secret so buried that it took a death to unearth it. You will not want to miss it.